and of frying onions and garlic was the first sign of dawn in the bustling city, a humble beacon that announced Annie's presence long before the sun crested the towering glass and steel skyline. Her world was a 10-foot square patch of warm pavement, home to a modest food stall that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The stall, a patchwork of faded blue tarpaulin and weathered wood, stood as a quiet testament to resilience amidst the relentless river of traffic and hurried footsteps. The morning long before the city truly awoke, Annie arrived, her movements practiced meditative ritual. She would ignite the twin gas burners, their blue flames hissing to life, and arrange her simple ingredients with a quiet reverence: plum tomatoes, crisp cucumbers, and fragrant herbs, all waiting to be transformed. Her life was tapestry woven with simple threads. There was a profound peace in the rhythmic chowing of vegetables, the sizzle of dough hitting the hot griddles. From the customers who came for a taste of her unpretentious, hearty food, she knew them all: the construction workers with dust on their boots, the office clerks rushing for their morning train, the weary taxi drivers seeking a moment's respite. For each, she had a kind word, an extra spoonful of chutney, or a warm, knowing smile. Her generosity was as innate as her breath, a quiet offering that asked for nothing more. When she earned were just enough to pay for the stall's rent and her small rented room, but the true currency of her life was the small community she nurtured daily. It was during the lull of the late afternoon, as the sun cast long, distorted shadows, that she first noticed the boy. He was a flicker of gray and brown, a small, thin figure half hidden in the recessed doorway of a shuttered shop across the street. Shoveled hair fell across his forehead, and his clothes hung loosely on his narrow frame. He never approached, never begged. He simply watched, his dark eyes fixed on the stall, on the steam rising from her pots, on the customers eating with satisfied expressions. Annie's heart, so accustomed to giving, felt a peculiar tug. She began to notice the subtle details: the way he shivered slightly in the cool breeze, the hollows in his young cheeks, the weariness in his posture that suggested he was ready to bolt at any moment. Continued her work kneading dough and wiping counters, but a part of her consciousness remained fixed on the small, silent observer. She started setting aside a little extra food each day: perfectly golden paratha, a bowl of lentil soup, wrapping it carefully and placing it on the corner of her counter, a silent, hopeful invitation. But the boy remained a ghost at the periphery, a living embodiment of the city's countless unnoticed struggles. His quiet compassion, a steady flame in her chest, burned a little brighter, waiting for the moment it could truly reach out and warm the cold, lonely. Ida, watching from across the street, the wind had a bite to it that afternoon, a sharp, unseasonable cold that snatched at the steam rising from Annie's pots and sent scraps of paper skittering down the glare. It was this wind that finally broke the silent standoff. The boy, who had been a statue in the shadowed doorway for over an hour, could no longer suppress the violent shiver that racked his small body. Tremor was so pronounced it seemed to ripple the very air around him, a stark, physical plea that cut through the city's noise and went straight to Annie's heart. She had been waiting for a sign, any sign, and that was it. Moving with a deliberate slowness so as not to startle him, she took a clean bowl and ladled it full of the day's stew, a thick, hearty mixture of potatoes, carrots, and tender chunks of meat, its rich, savory scent of tangible warmth against the chin. Placed the bowl on the small, rickety table she kept for customers, along with a spoon and a thick slice of bread. Then she did not call out or gesture. She simply took a deliberate step back, turning her attention to scrubbing an already clean section of countertop, giving him the space and the illusion of anonymity he seemed to crave. For a long moment, nothing happened. The city continued its indifferent rush. Then, a flicker of movement. He emerged from the doorway like a creature from a burrow, hesitant and watchful. Eyes, dark pools of caution, darted from the bowl of steamed food to Annie's back and then to the street around them, seeing every powerful thread. Each step was a calculated risk, his thin shoulders hunched, ready for flight. A few meters between the doorway and the stall seemed like a vast treacherous plain he had to cross. He reached the table, his gaze locked on the stew as if it were a mirage that might disappear. His fingers, grimy and trembling, hovered over the spoon. Looked at Annie once more, a look of such profound and weary vulnerability. Stole her breath. It was the look of someone who had been offered hope before, only to have it snatched away. In that silent exchange, Annie saw not just hunger, but a deep, abiding sadness that seemed too heavy for such inroads. Finally, his hunger overpowering his fear, he picked up the spoon. First taste was tentative, but then a primal need took over. He ate with a focused intensity, a quiet desperation that spoke of meals missed and a stomach too often. Continued her gentle pantomime of work, her own heart aching with a mixture of pity and a fierce protective warmth. When he had finished scraping the bowl clean, he stood there, looking lost, the empty bowl a sudden barrier between them. Annie moved then, slowly approaching the table. She did not reach for the bowl. Instead, she stood beside him, her presence a quiet anchor in his tumultuous world. She looked at him, really looked, taking in the fine-boned structure of his face beneath the dirt. Intelligence in his weary eyes. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of unspoken stories and a shared fragile understanding. She reached out, her hand slow and non-threatening, and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Her touch was feather-light, but he flinched for a second before stilling, his eyes wide. Leo, she said softly, the name coming to her as naturally as breathing. She didn't know how she knew it, but it felt right. You do not need to be hungry. Voice was a low, steady murmur, promise woven into the cold air. Come back tomorrow, come back every day. I will always have food for you. It was not an offer, but a vow, the foundation of a bond built not on words, but on a simple, profound act of seeing someone who had become invisible to the world. The simple promise of a meal became the anchor of Leo's existence. The next day, as the late afternoon light softened and bled into gold, he was there again, hesitant. The edge of the bustling footpath. This time he did not linger in the shadows. He approached the stall with a quiet, deliberate step, his eyes fixed on Annie. She was ready for him, plate already waiting, a golden flake paratha, a small bowl of space chickpeas, and a slice of sweet, milky butter. She placed it on the small table with a nod, her smile a gentle, imperfect thing, and then turned back to her work, giving him the gift of space. The pattern repeated itself day after day, until the weeks bled into a new, quiet rhythm. The city's chaos became the backdrop to their silent, developing ballet. Leo's arrival was no longer an event, but a certainty, as dependable as the setting sun. His thin frame began to fill out, the sharp angles of his collarbones softening beneath the same worn shirt. The hollows in his cheeks became less pronounced, replaced by the healthy glow of consistent nourishment. Transformation was not merely physical. After finishing his meal one day, instead of slipping away, he lingered. He watched Annie as she wiped down the counter, her movements efficient and graceful. Then, with a shyness that was almost painful to witness, he picked up a clean rag from the stack and began to mimic her, carefully swiping at the vacant table where he had just eaten. It was a small, clumsy gesture, but to Anya, it felt monumental. It was his first offering, a wordless attempt to repay a debt he felt he owed. That day on, helping became part of his ritual. He would wipe down the tables, stack the stools, or carefully arrange the condiment jars in neat silver rows. Annie never instructed him, never thanked him with words. She would simply pause in her work, meet his eye, and offer a slow, warm smile that reached the corners of her eyes. In return, a shy, fleeting smile would sometimes touch his own lips, a bridal bloom in the barren landscape of his youth. It was a language built on glances and small actions and understanding. ran deeper than speech. During the quiet lulls as Leo focused on his self-appointed tasks, Annie's mind would drift. Watching his small, serious face, she saw echoes of her own past. She remembered the gnawing emptiness of her own childhood, the years of scraping by after losing her friends, the countless small humiliations that came with poverty. She had built this doll from nothing, her hands raw and her spirit worried, but she had built it. In Leo, she felt a fierce maternal pull, a deep-seated need to shield him from the same cold indifference she had once known. Her kindness was no longer just generosity. It was a form of armor she was constructing around him, one more meal, one gentle smile at a time. And slowly, brick by brick, that armor seemed to be working. The constant weariness in Leo's eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning sense of safety. Smiles came more frequently, less fleeting, sometimes even reaching his eyes and lighting them from within. He started to stand a little taller, his posture less defensive. He was opening up, not with words, but with the quiet, trusting presence of a creature learning it was no longer alone in the wilderness. In the steady, consistent warmth of Annie's stall, amidst the sizzle of oil and the scent of spices, profound truth was being quietly demonstrated. The most powerful healing often comes not from grand gestures, but from the patient, daily ritual of kindness. The bridal piece they had built began to show hairline fractures. The change in Leo was subtle at first, a slight tightening around his eyes, a new hesitation in his step as he approached the stall. The awareness that Annie had worked so hard to soothe came flooding back, not as a constant state, but in sharp, sudden waves. He would be carefully weighing a table, his movements calm and focused, and then he would freeze, his head snapping up as if he'd heard a distant, familiar sound. His eyes, once beginning to hold a soft light, scanned the crowded street with a frantic, hunted intensity, searching the faces of strangers, peering into the dark muscle valleys, his body cold like a spring. Annie watched this new anxiety with a growing knot of concern in her stomach. The boy who had started to smile was gone, replaced by this jumpy, haunted version. He started choosing a different spot to eat, always with his back to a wall, his gaze forever fixed on the third. Shoulders were practically hunched, as if expecting a blow from behind. The simple act of accepting a bowl of food from her hands now came with a furtive glance over his shoulder, a quick, nervous intake of breath. The shadows he had emerged from were no longer just across the street. They had followed him, clinging to his small frame like a shroud. She ached to ask, to demand to know what phantom he was so desperate trying to evade. She wanted to wrap him in her arms and promise him that nothing could hurt him here, in the circle of her action, but she had learned the language of his silence, and she knew that pressing him would only make him retreat, or worse, vanish entirely. So she respected his unspoken boundaries, offering her care in different, quieter ways. She began making his favorite potatoes to paradas more often, the extra attention to detail a silent message of her steadfastness. When she handed him his plate, she would let her hand rest near his for a moment longer than necessary, brief, grounded. We point out a plump, content vision, or particularly colorful truck rumbling past small, mundane observations designed to tether him back to the safety of the prison. Then the rains came. It started as a drizzle of fine mist spray that softened the edges of the city and drew the scent of wet asphalt and dust from the ground. But by evening, the sky had opened, releasing a torrential downpour that drummed a frantic rhythm on the stall's tarpaulin roof, the street's end. Usual bustle replaced by the hiss of tires on wet roads and the steady roar of the rain. He had finished his meal, but made no move to leave, staring out at the silver curtain of water with a look of profound resignation. He was shivering again, but this time it was from the damp cold that seeped into bones. Annie watched him, the small, drenched sparrow trapped in a storm. Without a word, she ducked into the tiny storage space behind him. Tucked away with spare sacks of flour and lentils was an old woolen blanket. It was thick and slight scratchy, its navy blue color faded to soft gray in patches. It had been her father's, a rug from a simpler time, and it carried the faint, comforting scent of camphor and memories. She brought it out, holding it in her hands for a moment, feeling its weight and its history. She walked over to Leo and simply held it out. Looked from the blanket to her face, his expression a complex map of surprise, gratitude, and a lingering of distrust. He did not take it immediately. He seemed to be weighing the offering, understanding that it was more than just fabric. It was an invitation into a deeper layer of her world, a tangible piece of her own past offered as a shield for his. Finally, his fingers, cold and damp, reached out and closed around the wall. He pulled it towards his chest, clutching it tightly, burying his face in its folds for a brief second. He did not say thank you. He didn't. But he wrapped the blanket around his thin shoulders, pulling it closed like a suit of armor said everything. It was a symbol of protection, a physical manifestation of the unspoken trust that had been growing between them. As he stood there shrouded in the old blanket, watching the rain with her in the warm, dry cocoon of the stall, the shadows outside seemed for a moment to recede. The storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of shelter had been firmly silent. The world can fracture and end. Its fragile piece shattered not by storm or an earthquake, but by the sleek, silent glide of ambition and power. One moment, the afternoon was a familiar symphony of honking cars, chattering pedestrians, and the rhythmic sizzle from Annie's grill. The next, the air itself seemed to stiffen, the city's cacophony dimming under a new, oppressive weight. It was the sound of tires, not the worn tread of taxis or buses, but the aggressive screech of expensive rubber biting into asphalt, a sound that commanded immediate and terrified attention. Four black SUVs, massive and window-tinted, slid into the curb near Annie's stall like a pack of predatory beasts crawling prey. They were impossibly clean, their glossy surfaces reflecting the grimy street in distorted menacing waves. Doors opened in unison, and a small army of men in impeccably tailored dark suits emerged. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency, their faces impassive, their eyes hidden behind glasses that turned them into anonymous, threatening statues. The bustling footpath froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. A vegetable vendor dropped a potato, the dull thud unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. All eyes were drawn to the spectacle, a scene of wealth and authority that felt alien and invasive in the humble context of the roadside. Annie's hand, which had been loudly encouraged, still didn't move. First foolish thought was of city officials, come to demand a permit she didn't have or to finally shatter the simple life she had built. But the sheer aggressive opulence of the vehicles, the cold professionalism of the men, spoke of something far more formidable than municipal bureaucracy. Her gaze instinctively darted to Leo. He had been sacking clean bowls, his small back to the street. The sound of the tires, his entire body went. The bowl he was holding slipped from his fingers, hitting the plastic tub with a sharp crack that made Annie flinch. He turned. Bully as if moving through hardened concrete, and his face drained of all color, leaving his skin a sickly waxy gray. The shy light that had recently begun to kindle in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by raw primal terror that was terrible to behold. His breath hitched, a small, desperate sound lost in the silence. He stumbled back a step, his hand flying out to clutch Annie's arm. His grip was vise-like, his small fingers digging into her flesh with a strength born of shame. He was trembling violently, a leaf in a hurricane of his own fear. Annie's own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of confusion and a swiftly rising maternal fury. Without a conscious thought, she moved, stepping in front of Leo, playing her body as a shield between him and the suited men. Her worn apron and simple clothes were a pathetic defense against whatever there was, but it was all she had. She could feel the fine tremors running through Leo's small frame where he pressed. Her back, his face buried in the fabric of her dress. Her mind raced, trying to piece together a reason, explanation for this invasion, but found only the memory of Leo's recent, haunted glances, his constant, fearful vigilance. The shadows he had been fleeing had finally arrived, and they had arrived in force. The men formed a loose, intimidating perimeter, and then, from the lead vehicle, one more figure emerged. He was older than the others, his suit a shade darker, his authority emanating from him in an almost physical way. He did not wear sunglasses, and his eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the scene before landing squarely on Anya and the small, terrified boy hiding behind him. He took a single step forward, the polished toe of his shoe was stark black against the dust pavement. The air grew thick, charged with the suspense that was almost unreal. The entire world had narrowed to this 10-foot square patch of pavement, to a kind-hearted woman guarding a trembling. Held in the powerful unknown man whose arrival had frozen time itself. The man's gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on the fragile silence. It swept over Annie's defensive posture, her white-knuckled grip on her ladle, and then softened infinitesimally as it found the top of Leo's head, the only part of him visible behind him. Took another step, his movement deliberate and unnerving quiet, stark contrast to the city's usual clamor that was only now beginning to trickle back. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in a placating gesture, his palm open and empty. His voice, when it came, was a low, cultured baritone, carefully modulated to soothe, yet it carried an undeniable weight of authority that cut through the remaining tension. He identified himself as Alexander when he was free. Words landed not as a statement, but as a seismic shock, rearranging the entire landscape of Annie's understanding. He spoke of a family of immense wealth, of a life of private tutoring. Growing estates, a world so distant from the steam and grit of her food stall it felt like a scene from a film. He explained, his words measured but laced with a raw paternal anguish, how they had lost Leo months ago, after a traumatic car accident that had also claimed his mother's life. The boy had simply vanished from the hospital, a small green ghost swallowed by the city's indifferent winds. Xander's eyes, a mirror of Leo's own dark ones, glistened with unshed tears as he expressed his profound, overwhelming gratitude to Annie. He called her an angel, guardian, his voice cracking with an emotion so genuine it was impossible to doubt. He revealed that Leo had run away, not from them, but from the suffocating grief, from a home that had become a mausoleum of memories he could no longer bear. Pieces of the puzzle that had been Leo, his silence, his fear, his deep, abiding sadness, clicked into a heartbreaking picture for Annie. The wealthy family was not the monster she feared, but another victim of the same tragedy. A complex storm of emotion broke within her. The fierce, protective anger she had felt moments before dissolved, leaving behind a hollowed-out relief so potent it made her knees feel weak. It was intertwined with a sharp, piercing shock at the sheer scale of the life Leo had fled, a world of privilege that clashed violently with the humble reality of her own existence. Doll, her simple food, her warm blanket, these small offerings felt absurdly insignificant against the backdrop of private security details and glossy black SUVs. It was Leo who broke the final seal of them all. Still clinging to Anya, he slowly lifted his tear-streaked face from the fabric of her dress. He looked at his father, and the raw terror in his eyes gradually melted, replaced by a flood of conflicting emotions, recognition, guilt, and a profound wound. He gave a small, jerky nod, a silent confirmation that shattered the last of Annie's doubts. Escaped him a ragged, heart-wrenching sound, and he buried his face against Annie once more, his small body shaking not with fear now, but with the release of a burden he had carried alone for far too long. In that tearful, silent affirmation of the two worlds, one of unimaginable wealth and one of simple, steadfast humility, lied not in conflict, but in a shared, aching understanding of loss and the unexpected path to finding solace. Truth, once spoken, hung in the air between them, a delicate, painful tapestry woven from threads of grief and gratitude. Alexander's composed facade began to crumble as he looked from his son's trembling form to the woman who had become his sanctuary. He gestured to the small, rickety stool by Annie's counter, a silent request for a moment in this humble space that had meant more to his child than any gilded room in the village. Near her own heart, tumultuous sea gave a slow, numb nod. He began to speak again, his voice softer now, strict. Its commanding tone and filled with the raw ache of a father's helplessness. He painted a picture of a home that had become a ghost of itself after the accident. He described Leo, once a vibrant boy filled with laughter, retreating into a shell of silence, his eyes hollowed out by a loss too profound for his young heart to process. Doctors had called it shock, the therapists had spoken of trauma, but Alexander confessed that all their wealth and resources had been useless against the simple, devastating fact that his son felt utterly and completely abandoned. In the echoing silence of their large house, surrounded by hired help and sympathetic relatives, Leo had felt more alone than ever. The world had kept turning, business demanded attention, and in the chaos of his own grief, Alexander had failed to see that his son was drowning in plain sight. The running away was not an act of rebellion, but one of sheer, desperate survival. Leo had not run toward anything, Alexander. Blamed, his gaze fixed on the top of his son's head. He had simply run from the unbearable emptiness. He had vanished into the city's underbelly, a small, lost soul navigating a landscape of concrete and indifference, until he had found his way to this specific corner, to the scent of frying onions and the quiet, steady presence of a woman who asked for nothing. It was here, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion, that Leo had found what his family and all its wealth could not provide. He spoke of the private investigators' reports, the grain photos they had eventually obtained, showing Leo not as a scared, hungry urchin, but as a bull waiting tables, accepting a bowl of food, posture slowly uncoiling from its defensive craft. He described the profound shock of seeing in those images, the first glimpse of peace on his son's face again. And his unconditional kindness, her daily ritual of offering food without demand or pity, had become Leo's sole solace. It was that. She rebuilt not of money, but of compassion, a quiet harbor in the storm of his grief. Annie listened, her hands still clutching the edge of her counter. Sounds of the city faded into a distant hum as his words washed over her. She saw her own actions through his eyes, the extra bravado of the old blanket, the patient silence, and understood their true weight. They had not just been meals, they had been lifelines. But she had not realized she was holding back again to stream down her face, tracing clean paths through the fine layer of flour on her cheeks. They were tears not of sadness, but of a profound aching understanding. She had not simply fed a hungry boy, she had sheltered a shattered heart. Feeling her quiet tears, Leo slowly loosened his desperate grip on her dress and turned. His small face was blotchy and wet, his eyes were dimmed, but they met hers with a clarity that had been absent before. In them, she saw the full depth of his gratitude, the unspoken bond that had. In her own language, he did not look at the luxurious cars or his waiting father. He looked only at her. Then he stepped forward and wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, burying his face against her. It was not the clutch of terror from before, but a hug of pure, heartfelt thanks. A sob racked his small frame, and he whispered 2 words into the fabric of her apron, words that sealed the heartfelt revelation and many the piece of his broken will. He murmured, his voice muffled but clear, "For being my home." The offer of a check, thick and imposing, was presented with sincere gratitude, but Annie gently shook her head, her work-roughened hands remaining at her sides. Money was a temporary solution, a transaction that would settle accounts she had never intended to open. Alexander, understanding the quiet dignity in her refusal, did not press. Instead, he proposed a different form of gratitude, one that honored the spirit of her generosity. Within a week, this patch of pavement was transformed. A team of carpenters and electricians arrived. They labored not a noisy intrusion, but a quiet, purposeful symphony of creation. The faded tarpaulin and weathered wood were carefully dismantled, replaced by sturdy, clean-lined structure with a prop counter, a gleaming stainless steel serving area, and a bright red awning that cast a cheerful glow. Installed a small, efficient refrigerator and a second gas burner, turning her humble stall into proper, respectable eatery. It was not an act of charity, but an investment in the very goodness that had saved his son. Annie watched the metamorphosis with a sense of profound wonder. Her stall, her entire world, was being fortified, its foundation made secure. The renovation ensured her financial stability in a way a single lump sum never could. It was a future built not on a handout, but on a hand up, a testament to the belief that her small corner of kindness was worth preserving. Defying the first day she served food from the new stall, her regular customers marveled at the change, their congratulations warm and genuine. But the true mark of its success was the sight of a sleek black car pulling up to the curb each Saturday afternoon. Fleet would emerge, his clothes clean and fitting properly, his face no longer thin or haunted. He would run to the stall, not as a refugee, but as a visitor returning to church. He'd sit at the small table, now painted a fresh blue, and eat a bowl of spiced chickpeas. And for a little while, he was just Leo again, helping her stack plates and sharing quiet smiles that spoke of a bond that transcended words. Standing in her new eatery, watching Leo laugh at something a passing vendor said, Annie felt a deep, humbling realization settle in. Her simple act of offering a single meal to a hungry boy had been a pebble dropped into the still waters of an indifferent world. She had not set out to change a life, to alleviate a moment's suffering. Yet that small deed had created concentric circles of profound change. It had led a lost child back to his family. It had mended a fracture in a grieving household, and it had now secured her own future, allowing her to continue her work with greater reach and comfort. The ripple had traveled far beyond her imagination, proving that true goodness was never a solitary event, but a beacon. Evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, she noticed a new figure lingering at the edge of the bustling footpath. An elderly man, his clothes threadbare and his posture bent with weariness, watched the steam rising from her pots with a familiar, hollow-eyed gaze. Annie's heart, so full from the day's blessings, recognized the look instantly. Without hesitation, she prepared a plate, a warm paratha, a generous serving of vegetable curry, a slice of sweet loaf. He walked over to where the man stood uncertainly and held it. To him, with the same gentle, unquestioning smile she had once offered a frank boy. His eyes widened in surprise, then filled with a weird gratitude as he accepted the food. As he began to eat, finding a quiet spot against the wall, Annie returned to her stall, her spirit light. The cycle was not broken, it was just beginning. The ripple of her goodness was now a wave, and she was merely its humble, steadfast source, ready to pass it on, one more meal at a time.